Name? The judge asked with a raised eyebrow, glancing over his glasses as a teenage boy stepped up to the defendant's table. The courtroom, quiet and heavy with expectation, seemed to breathe in anticipation. The boy, barely 17, wore a suit 2 sizes too big, the sleeves brushing against his knuckles. A nervous cough came from someone in the gallery. The boy straightened his back. "James Carter, Your Honor," he replied, his voice calm but carrying a subtle edge, like someone who had something to prove. A chuckle came from the judge. "Is this some kind of joke? Where's your lawyer, son?" "I'll be representing myself," James said, with a quiet certainty that turned a few heads. The judge leaned back in his chair, amused. "Representing yourself? This should be interesting." Whispers began to rise from the courtroom. People shuffled in their seats, intrigued. A teenager defending himself in court? It sounded absurd. Almost like a prank. But James didn't smile. He didn't shift uncomfortably or second-guess his decision. He just stood there, eyes locked on the judge, unshaken. Outside the windows, rain drizzled steadily, casting gray shadows on the wooden floors. Inside, tension hung thick in the air. James wasn't just another teenager in trouble, he was here for something serious. Something that could ruin his life if he didn't handle it just right. Earlier that week, he'd been arrested under suspicion of a cybercrime, hacking into the school district system. Not to change his grades, as many assumed, but to expose a hidden network of data manipulation. But the headlines didn't care about that part. All they saw was a high school kid accused of hacking. His court-appointed lawyer, clearly overwhelmed and indifferent, had suggested a quick plea deal. But James knew the system. He knew it better than most people twice his age. Because James had spent the last 5 years studying law in secret. Not from textbooks in a classroom, but from watching trials online, reading legal documents at night, and teaching himself everything from torts to constitutional rights. He didn't do it for fun. He did it out of necessity. Back when he was 12, his older brother, Marcus, was wrongly imprisoned. A public defender barely fought for him, and the court didn't listen. Since that day, James had made it his mission to understand the law, not just to free his brother, but to never be powerless again. Now here he was, standing in a courtroom, being mocked by a man in a robe who had no idea who he was dealing with. The judge smirked. "Son, I suggest you reconsider. This isn't a school debate. This is real court. Real consequences." James tilted his head slightly. "I understand that, Your Honor. I've filed my pretrial motions and submitted my witness list." That wiped the smirk off the judge's face. He glanced down at the docket, flipping through the paperwork. Everything was there. Typed, formatted properly, with legal citations that were, shockingly, correct. A few attorneys in the gallery whispered to one another, curiosity spreading like wildfire. A clerk leaned over to the bailiff. Did he really do all that by himself? The judge tried to regain control. "Even so, you're still a kid. This court doesn't play pretend." James took a breath. "With all due respect, Your Honor, the Constitution guarantees the right to self-representation under the Sixth Amendment. Age is not a barrier unless declared incompetent. And I assure you, I'm more than competent." Gasps fluttered through the room. Not because he was disrespectful, he wasn't. It was the confidence. The way he spoke. The way he held his ground. Even the stenographer looked up from her keys. But this case wasn't just about James and his knowledge of the law. It was about something much deeper. Behind those brown eyes was a young man carrying more than just his own burden. The evidence James planned to present, if the court even allowed it, would reveal corruption in the school board, the misuse of private student data, and the manipulation of scholarship decisions that cost countless students their futures. The system had failed, and now the system was scared of being exposed by a teenager. Still, the judge wasn't buying it. "Let's proceed then," he said, tapping his gavel with a heavy thud. "But you should know, if you mess this up, I'm not giving you a second chance." James gave a single nod. "Understood, Your Honor." His hands didn't shake as he walked back to his seat. His heart was racing, sure, but not from fear. From focus. He pulled out a worn binder, thick with handwritten notes, case law printouts, and strategy flowcharts. He'd prepared for this moment like his life depended on it, because it did. In the back of the room, a woman watched silently. Mid-30s, dressed in casual jeans and a windbreaker. No one noticed her except James. She gave him a tiny nod. That was Emily Ruiz, a former attorney-turned-journalist. She'd been following James's story quietly ever since he sent her a cryptic email months ago. She didn't know the whole plan, James hadn't told anyone everything, but she knew this boy wasn't what he seemed. He wasn't a criminal. He was a weapon. The prosecution stood to present their opening statement, clearly expecting a walk in the park. After all, how hard could it be to crush a teenager in court? But as James opened his binder and adjusted his glasses, something changed in the room. A shift. The kind you feel when the underdog stops being underestimated. He leaned forward and whispered to himself, "Let's begin." And just like that, the chessboard was set. Pieces in place. Moves calculated. But what James didn't know, what no one knew, was that someone else in that courtroom was watching him closely. Someone with a hidden agenda. Someone who wasn't there for justice, but for control. Because exposing the truth wouldn't just shake the school district, it would shake the city. The judge thought this was going to be an easy day. He had no idea the boy standing in front of him wasn't just some kid trying to play grown-up. He was about to face a legal mind sharper than any he'd seen in years. And the real trial hadn't even started yet. What happens when a system built on assumptions meets a mind built in the shadows? Stay tuned. Because the courtroom is about to witness something it's never seen before. James Carter sat motionless, eyes scanning the prosecutor as she rose from her chair. DA Michelle Travers was a sharp woman in her 40s, known for her no-nonsense attitude and perfect conviction record. She adjusted her blazer and walked confidently to the jury, her heels echoing across the courtroom floor. "This is a simple case," she began, smiling politely to the jurors. A high school student, brilliant perhaps, but misguided, used his talents to break into a secure school system. He accessed private data, manipulated files, and compromised the integrity of the entire district's record system. This is not some prank. This is a crime. And the evidence will show that James Carter acted knowingly and maliciously. She turned and pointed subtly in James's direction, as if he were some cautionary tale. James didn't flinch. He knew this strategy. Paint the accused as clever but reckless. Remind the jury that intelligence doesn't cancel out intent. Still, something about her phrasing stood out. She used the word malicious like a blade, sharp and deliberate. That meant they were pushing for more than just a slap on the wrist. They wanted to make an example of him. Michelle returned to her seat, and the judge looked down at James. "Defendant, are you ready with your opening statement?" "Yes, Your Honor," James said as he stood. He didn't walk to the jury box right away. Instead, he stood still for a moment, allowing silence to stretch just long enough to feel deliberate. Then he walked slowly, carefully, like every step was calculated. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "I'm not here today to deny what I did. I did access the school system. I did look at the files. But I didn't do it to cheat, or steal, or cause harm. I did it because I discovered something wrong, something hidden. And when I tried to report it, no one listened." The courtroom remained still. James glanced at his binder, but he didn't open it. Instead, he let his words carry the weight. "You'll hear the prosecution call me a criminal. But you won't hear them talk about why the school board quietly fired 2 IT staff members last month. You won't hear them talk about the forged scholarship decisions. Or how one student, my best friend, actually, was denied a scholarship he earned, while another student with connections to a board member got it instead." He stopped for a second. "Let it sink in. I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I'll show you the emails. The altered data logs. The whistleblower report I submitted that went ignored. And I'll prove that the only crime here is the one no one wants to talk about." He gave a slight nod and returned to his seat. The jury didn't look at him like they had before. They weren't seeing a child anymore. They were seeing something different. Maybe not yet a peer, but something close enough to make them hesitate. The judge cleared his throat. "Very well. Prosecution, call your first witness." As the trial began in earnest, a mix of curiosity and unease settled over the courtroom. The first few witnesses were predictable: the school's head of IT, a district administrator, and a cybersecurity consultant hired after the breach. They described in technical detail how the system was accessed, how someone had bypassed firewalls and encryption. They described the intrusion as high-level, sophisticated, and intentional. But they never once explained how James, a student with no formal training, could have pulled it off alone. When James cross-examined, his questions were pointed but respectful. He asked about timestamps, internal audit trails, and policies the district failed to enforce. The witnesses squirmed at times, not used to being questioned by someone who looked like he should be taking a math test, not grilling them in open court. "Would it be fair to say," James asked the cybersecurity expert, "that your firm was hired after the breach, not before?" "Yes." "So your assessment is based on assumptions from data you didn't originally collect?" "Well, we based it on the logs available to us, which were stored by the very system that was compromised." A pause. "That's correct." James nodded and sat down. By the end of the day, murmurs were running through the gallery. People were whispering about the kid lawyer. One juror kept glancing at him, brows drawn, like trying to solve a puzzle. But James wasn't paying attention to that. He was watching someone else. Near the back of the room, the woman in the windbreaker, Emily Ruiz, typed notes into her phone. She wasn't just a journalist. She had once been a civil rights attorney with a reputation for uncovering corruption in school boards and municipal courts. She'd walked away from the law after a case went south, but she'd never lost her nose for a cover-up. James had reached out to her with one promise: "If you show up, I'll show you something worth writing about." She believed him now. She just didn't know how deep this went. Later that evening, as court adjourned for the day, James sat alone at the long wooden table, packing his papers. Most of the other people had left. Only the janitor was mopping at the back of the room, humming softly. The judge lingered a moment before leaving. "You're walking a tightrope, young man." James didn't look up. "Sometimes it's the only way across." The judge gave him a long stare, then left. Outside, the sky was dark. Streetlights flickered as James walked toward the city bus stop. His backpack was heavy, not with books, but with truth no one had wanted to see until now. He thought about his brother, Marcus, sitting in a prison cell because of a court-appointed lawyer who didn't care and a judge who didn't listen. James had sat in the back of that courtroom as a kid, watching it all fall apart. He'd promised himself he'd never let that happen again. Now he was standing in a courtroom of his own. Alone. Fighting not just for himself, but for every student who'd been robbed, every kid who'd been told they didn't have a chance. But what James didn't know was that D.A. Travers had been tipped off about something he hadn't anticipated. A sealed file. Something buried deep in the district's records, connected to a name he never expected to hear again. Marcus Carter. And as she left the courthouse that night, she made one call. "Get me everything we have on the Carter brothers. Every file. Every note. I want it on my desk by morning." Because if James thought he was playing chess, he hadn't realized someone had already moved pieces behind the board. And tomorrow, the game was going to change. James barely slept that night. He lay in bed, the ceiling fan spinning shadows across the walls, his mind racing with every piece of the case. Each document, each email, each slip-up the district had made, it all lived in his head now. But something felt off. He couldn't shake the judge's words, that warning before he left the courtroom, "You're walking a tightrope." At 6 a.m., he sat at the kitchen table of the small apartment he shared with his grandmother. She was already up, making tea. Her hands moved slowly now, stiff with age, but her eyes stayed sharp. "You're quiet today," she said softly, sliding a cup toward him. "I think they're digging," James replied. "Let them dig," she said without hesitation. "You're not the one with secrets." He wanted to believe that, but deep down he knew it wasn't so simple. Not when Marcus's name was starting to circle the case. Not when the past he'd worked so hard to push down was starting to rise again. By the time he arrived at court, there was a different energy in the air. A local news crew was setting up outside the courthouse, asking passers-by about the teenage attorney. Word had gotten out. Some people were starting to root for him. Others saw him as a kid playing dress-up. But no one was neutral. Inside, the prosecution introduced a surprise witness, Carla Jennings, a former administrative assistant for the district scholarship committee. She wore a beige suit and looked nervous, her fingers twisting a tissue in her lap. Travers asked simple questions at first: her job, her responsibilities, her access to records. Then came the setup. "Ms. Jennings, did you ever notice anything strange in the system before the breach?" She hesitated. "Yes, but I didn't think much of it at the time." "And did you report it?" "No. I didn't know who to go to. I was afraid I'd lose my job." Travers turned to the jury. "You see, members of the jury, even before the defendant touched the system, there were whispers of confusion. But rather than report through the proper channels, he decided to take matters into his own hands, and break the law." James stood slowly, ready for cross. "Ms. Jennings," he said gently, "can you explain what you saw in the system?" She looked uneasy. Some students had their applications flagged. I wasn't sure why. It just looked odd. Were those flags placed by you? No. Were you ever told to ignore them? She nodded, very slightly. Once. I asked a supervisor about one student's flag, and she told me not to worry about it. Do you remember the student's name? She looked down at the tissue. I do. It was Elijah Bennett. The name struck James like a punch. Elijah had been one of the top students in their year, brilliant and hardworking. But he'd been denied every scholarship he applied for, and no one could explain why. James looked at the jury. And did you notice who got the scholarship Elijah was denied? Travers objected, but the judge overruled it. Carla Jennings nodded again. Yes. It was given to a student named Ryan DeMarco. His father sits on the board. A silence fell across the courtroom. Travers quickly wrapped up and moved on, but the damage was done. The jury had heard it, plain and clear. James wasn't just poking around in the system for fun. He was following a trail. A trail others were too afraid to talk about. During recess, James stepped outside into the hallway, hoping for a moment of quiet. That's when Emily Ruiz appeared beside him. They're scared now, she said, watching the courtroom doors. I spoke to someone at the district. They're shredding documents. Literally shredding them. Do you have proof? Not yet. But I've seen this before. They're scrambling to cover something big. James looked down the hall. I think they're tying Marcus to this. Emily raised an eyebrow. Why? Because they know I'm winning. So they're trying to make it personal. Make it messy. If they can paint Marcus as involved, maybe even make it look like he orchestrated this from prison, it'll destroy everything. Emily leaned closer. You're going to need a backup plan. That evening, after court, James visited Marcus at the state prison for the first time in months. The visiting room was cold and plain, but Marcus's presence filled it. You look tired, Marcus said, sitting down across from him. You look worse, James replied, a half-smile on his face. Marcus laughed. So what's going on? They're using your name. They're digging into your case. Trying to connect it to mine. Marcus leaned back, jaw tight. Let them. I got nothing left to lose. James stared at him. Don't say that. Marcus shook his head. You're the one with something to lose. Don't let them turn this into a family circus. Keep it clean. Don't let my mistakes weigh you down. James wanted to ask what Marcus meant by the mistakes, but he didn't. Not yet. When he left the prison, his mind wasn't just on the case anymore. It was on what he didn't know. What secrets Marcus might have kept. What the district might use against him. And what it would cost to keep the truth from slipping away. The next day in court, things escalated fast. The prosecution called a digital forensic expert to present logs that, according to them, proved James accessed confidential files far beyond the scholarship data. Files containing staff payroll, student medical records, even disciplinary histories. It was a serious accusation. James knew what it looked like he'd gone rogue, taken more than he had a right to. But something about the logs felt wrong. The timestamps were inconsistent. The access patterns didn't match how he had worked. It looked sloppy, almost too sloppy. James asked for a recess to verify the data. The judge allowed it. Back in the break room, he sat with Emily, flipping through the evidence file. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "I didn't access half this stuff." Emily scanned the pages. "Then someone else did. Someone who wanted to make it look like you went too far. They fabricated evidence. Or someone used your login credentials after the fact." James froze. His school laptop had been seized the day after the breach. But it had sat in the district's possession for over 24 hours before the police picked it up. That was enough time. Enough time for someone to add what they needed to ruin him. "They're not just trying to stop the truth," he whispered. "They're building a new lie." And now he had to prove it. Because the deeper he dug, the clearer it became, this wasn't just about a corrupted school system. It wasn't even about the case. It was about shutting him down before he exposed something bigger. And the question wasn't if they'd try again. It was how far they'd go. And who they were really protecting. The courtroom was quiet the next morning, but it wasn't calm. There was a different kind of silence in the air, the kind that held its breath before something broke. James sat at the defense table, shoulders tense, jaw set. His mind wasn't just on the trial anymore, it was on time. Time running out. Time working against him. Every second that passed was another second the district could spin the story, bury evidence, or worse, drag Marcus deeper into this storm. Judge Holbrook entered, stern as always. "Let's proceed." The prosecution came out swinging. Michelle Travers wasn't wasting words anymore. She presented what they claimed was definitive proof, a screen-recorded login session tied to James's school account. The footage showed someone clicking through sensitive files late at night, far beyond what James had admitted to accessing. "This, members of the jury, is what intentional looks like," Travers said sharply. "Calculated. Deliberate." He had a mission, and it wasn't justice, it was control. James stared at the monitor. He watched the cursor move, watched the files open, but something didn't sit right. It wasn't just the time, it was the rhythm. Whoever did this didn't move like him. The clicks were too quick, the file paths too obvious. It looked staged. But the jury didn't know him well enough to see that. All they saw was the footage. When it was James's turn to speak, he stood slowly. "Your Honor, I respectfully request a forensic review of this video. A second opinion. I believe this evidence has been altered." Travers immediately objected. "This is a delay tactic." But James didn't back down. "Then let the expert prove me wrong." The judge hesitated. The courtroom waited. Finally, Judge Holbrook nodded. "Motion granted. Court will reconvene in 48 hours. Outside the courthouse, the media was waiting. Microphones were shoved in James's face as he walked out. A few reporters asked questions, but one stuck out, a woman with short red hair and a badge that read Public Integrity Project. "James," she called, "is it true the school district had access to your laptop for a full day before law enforcement retrieved it?" He turned toward her. "That's correct." "Do you believe they tampered with it?" "I don't believe anything right now. But I'm going to find out." And with that, he walked on. That night, he met with Emily Ruiz and a former FBI tech specialist she'd called in, Trevor Hale. The three of them huddled around a table in the back of a coffee shop, laptop open, screen glowing in the dark. Trevor leaned back after reviewing the video for an hour. "Someone messed with this. See this clip? The metadata's been scrubbed. No timestamp continuity. And the cursor lag, it's inconsistent with real-time screen recording. It's a playback. James's heart pounded. Can you prove it? I can testify to it. That was their crack in the armor. But before they could celebrate, Emily pulled out her phone. Her face darkened as she read a message. What is it? James asked. It's Marcus, she said. He's been put in solitary. No warning. No explanation. James felt the world tilt. They're trying to shut him up. Emily nodded. They know you're close to something. This is their warning shot. James clenched his fists. He knew if they could silence Marcus, they might try to silence him next. The next day, James didn't go straight to court. He visited an old school staff member, Mr. Ellison, a retired counselor who had quietly helped students get into college when the system failed them. James had remembered that Ellison once kept backup files of scholarship submissions, just in case. When Ellison answered the door, his face lit up with surprise. James Carter. I heard about the trial. You've got the whole city talking. I need your help, James said. An hour later, they sat surrounded by dusty folders. And buried among them, James found it, Elijah Bennett's original scholarship file. The essay, the scores, the teacher recommendations. And a printed email from the board stating he was the top candidate. But the file had a handwritten note on it. Pulled. Reassigned. MD. James froze. MD, he said aloud. Martin DeMarco, Ellison whispered. Board member. Ryan's father. They had it. Proof the scholarship was stolen. Back in court, James moved like someone with a secret. Travers watched him closely. She felt it too, something had shifted. The momentum had changed. Trevor Hale took the stand and calmly dismantled the prosecution's video. This is not original footage, he explained to the jury. It's been edited. Someone wanted you to believe the defendant did more than he actually did. Travers tried to object, but it was weak. Her voice didn't carry the same confidence it had before. Then James called Carla Jennings back to the stand. This time, he showed her the note from Elijah's file. Is this your handwriting? He asked. She shook her head. No. Do you recognize the initials? She nodded. That's Martin DeMarco. He made decisions quietly. Told us who to give certain awards to. Said it was about political optics. The jury shifted uncomfortably. They weren't hearing about some rogue student anymore. They were seeing corruption, real, targeted corruption, backed by people in power. Then James handed the note to the judge. This isn't about a system breach. It's about a broken system. One that punished me for exposing it. But even as the room buzzed, James knew it wasn't over. That night, he received an anonymous email. No subject. Just a single sentence. You were never the target. Marcus was. Attached was a file. James opened it and nearly dropped the laptop. Inside was a scanned letter, an old email from the district to the state prison board, dated 2 months before the trial began. It requested Marcus's records under the guise of a background check related to a student under investigation. They'd been building this for a long time. It wasn't about James at all. It was about Marcus. James called Emily immediately. "They're trying to reopen Marcus's case," he said. "They want to tie everything back to him. If they do that, I lose credibility." And James couldn't finish the sentence. Emily was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Then we take the fight to them. No more playing defense." James didn't sleep that night. He spent the hours writing, pulling every file, every note, every name. Because the next day, when court reconvened, he wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was exposing everything. And the courtroom wasn't ready for what was coming. James arrived at the courthouse early the next morning, just as the city was beginning to stir. The sky was overcast, casting a gray hue across the marble steps. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the building as if trying to gather strength from its stone. Today wasn't just about clearing his name anymore, it was about finally pulling the mask off an entire system that had played dirty for years. He had all the pieces. Or at least, he thought he did. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the gallery. Students from his school sat quietly in the back, whispering to each other. And at the far end of the bench, he saw someone who hadn't been there before, Martin DeMarco himself. Clean-shaven, expensive suit, arms crossed like he didn't have a care in the world. But his eyes, those cold, watchful eyes, never left James. As court opened, Judge Holbrook looked more tense than usual. He adjusted his glasses slowly and leaned into the mic. "We have several motions on the table. Mr. Carter, you may proceed." James stood, holding a thick folder in one hand. "Your Honor, before we continue, I'd like to enter new evidence into the record. Documents that prove the school district knowingly reassigned scholarships under false pretenses." Travers immediately objected. "This is a stunt." But Judge Holbrook didn't shut him down this time. "Proceed." James walked to the jury box and held up the printed email and handwritten note from Elijah's file. "This is just one example. There are dozens like it. Students who were denied financial aid, college access, and opportunity. Not because they weren't qualified, but because someone behind the scenes decided they didn't fit the image the district wanted to present." He turned to face the gallery, locking eyes with DeMarco. That someone was on the board. "His name is Martin DeMarco." Gasps echoed through the room. Even Judge Holbrook blinked. Travers shot up. "Objection, this wasn't part of discovery." James didn't stop. "That's because this system isn't broken, it was rigged from the inside. And now that someone finally pulled the curtain back, they're trying to make me the scapegoat." The judge called for order, banging the gavel twice. But just as the courtroom started to settle, James's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Emily, "We have a bigger problem. Meet me outside. Now." He turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, may I request a brief recess?" With hesitation, it was granted. James met Emily in the hallway. She looked pale, shaken, holding her phone out with trembling hands. "I just got a message from someone at the district," she said. "An anonymous whistleblower." James read the text. It was a single sentence: the scholarship fund was never real money. It was a front. He looked up. "What does that mean?" Emily leaned closer. "It means they never had the budget for those scholarships to begin with. It was just a way to move money. Fake awards. Fake announcements. The kids never got the funds, they were redirected before disbursement." James blinked. Are you saying it was a laundering scheme? Emily nodded. And Marcus might have stumbled on it before you ever did. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Marcus's mysterious arrest. The sealed parts of his case. The quiet hush that had followed when he was sent away. They hadn't just targeted James to silence him, they'd framed Marcus first, years ago, to keep the real secret hidden. James clenched his jaw. We're not dealing with just a rigged scholarship system. We're dealing with financial fraud. Federal crime. They both stared at each other, stunned. Because now, everything was different. This wasn't just a fight for justice, it was a race against time. If the district figured out someone had exposed the money trail, there was no telling what they'd do next. And James knew they'd already proven how far they were willing to go. Back in court, he tried to keep calm, but the pressure had shifted. Every word he spoke felt heavier now, every glance from the jury more loaded. The prosecution noticed it too. Travers kept flipping through her files, clearly rattled. Then, out of nowhere, she dropped another bomb. We'd like to introduce a surprise rebuttal witness, she said. James's heart skipped. Judge Holbrook frowned. Is this within your rights? Travers smiled tightly. Yes, Your Honor. And the witness has direct knowledge of the defendant's alleged digital breach. The doors opened, and in walked Principal Gray. James's stomach sank. Gray took the stand with practiced ease, dressed in the same polished way he always appeared at assemblies. He didn't look nervous. If anything, he looked smug. Travers wasted no time. Mr. Gray, did the defendant ever express concern about the scholarship system directly to you? Yes, Gray replied. He brought it up multiple times. And how did you respond? I told him to stop digging. That it wasn't his concern. And what happened after that? Gray paused for effect. He broke into the system anyway. Even after being warned. Travers turned toward the jury. So he had a motive. A grudge. James stood. Your Honor, may I cross-examine? Judge Holbrook nodded. James approached the stand, every step filled with tension. Mr. Gray, did you receive any financial bonuses from the district in the last 3 years? Travers objected, but James continued. Answer the question. The judge nodded. He may answer. Gray hesitated. Yes. Performance bonuses. James lifted a page from the folder. This shows 3 transfers made to you during scholarship season, all routed through a third-party vendor with no contract on file. Can you explain that? Gray said nothing. James leaned in. You knew the funds were fake. You helped cover it up. You weren't protecting students, you were protecting your paycheck. The room exploded in whispers. Gray's face flushed red, but he didn't respond. And just as Judge Holbrook called for order again, James turned to the gallery, and saw someone unexpected. A woman in a federal suit. Observing. Taking notes. James didn't know who she was yet, but her badge read, Department of Education, Office of Inspector General. Someone higher up was watching now. The story had just gone national. And James wasn't just on trial anymore. He was blowing the lid off something much, much bigger. The courtroom was no longer just a courtroom. It had become something else entirely. A stage, a battleground, and a spotlight all at once. As murmurs rippled through the audience and the jury sat wide-eyed, James Carter could feel the pressure building like a wave about to break. The presence of the federal agent sitting silently in the gallery had changed everything. For the first time, those in power weren't just looking down at him, they were looking over their shoulders. Judge Holbrook banged the gavel, silencing the noise. "If I see another disruption, I'll clear the room." James took a steadying breath. It was now or never. "I have one final witness," he said. "And it's someone who has never spoken publicly about this, because they were afraid." There was a pause. The doors to the courtroom opened, and in walked Marcus. He looked thinner than the last time anyone had seen him, but he walked with purpose. The entire room fell silent. Even DeMarco leaned forward in his seat, suddenly tense. "Mr. Marcus Boone," James said, "do you swear to tell the truth?" "I do." Marcus sat down, gripping the edge of the witness stand. "Can you tell the court why you were really expelled 3 years ago?" Marcus looked out at the jury, then at Judge Holbrook. "Because I uncovered something I wasn't supposed to see. I worked part-time in the school's admin office. One day, I opened a spreadsheet that tracked scholarship funds. The numbers didn't add up. Thousands of dollars were being redirected into departments that didn't even exist." James nodded slowly. "And who did you tell?" "I went to Principal Gray. Thought he'd fix it." "What happened next?" Marcus exhaled. "I was called into the office 2 days later. They accused me of cheating on the SATs. Said I forged a recommendation letter. They kicked me out. No chance to defend myself. No hearing. Just gone." James turned to the jury. "And that's when the scholarship originally meant for Marcus was reassigned to someone else, someone connected to the school board." The courtroom felt frozen. People weren't just shocked. They were angry. Michelle Travers tried to object, but her voice was drowned out by the weight of truth. James could feel it, everything was shifting. Judge Holbrook looked shaken. For the first time in days, he didn't interrupt James. He didn't even blink. "I didn't hack the school system," James said quietly. "I followed a trail left behind by a friend who was thrown out like trash. And I brought the truth to light." The jury deliberated for 2 hours. When they returned, the air was so tight you could feel the heartbeat of the room. The forewoman stood. "In the matter of the people versus James Carter, we find the defendant not guilty." Cheers erupted in the courtroom. The judge struggled to restore order, but no one was listening anymore. Emily threw her arms around James. Marcus closed his eyes, smiling for the first time in years. James could barely breathe. It was over. But as the crowd filed out and reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, the story didn't end. Just as James was about to step outside, he was pulled aside by the federal agent, the woman who had been silently watching. "I'm Special Agent Dana Brooks with the Department of Education," she said. "I'll be leading a formal investigation into the scholarship fraud. We'll be contacting everyone involved, including Mr. DeMarco and Principal Gray." James nodded, relieved. "Good. They can't keep doing this." But then she handed him a small folder. "We've also uncovered something else," she said. "This isn't just your school. This network runs through 5 other districts in the state, same patterns, same missing funds. And your name came up in another investigation." James blinked, confused. "Mine?" She nodded. "There's a sealed record. A name change. You're not just a student, "Are you, James?" He froze. She leaned in. "Your real name is Jordan Cross. You were part of a youth legal program in D.C. 3 years ago, you helped expose corruption in a city housing project, then disappeared." James didn't say a word. Agent Brooks smiled faintly. "Looks like this isn't your first courtroom victory." The camera flashes outside brightened the hallway like lightning. The noise of the press grew louder. But inside, James stood still. Because even though the trial was over, the truth had one more twist to give. He wasn't just a teenage prodigy who outsmarted a courtroom. He was a trained undercover advocate, placed in the school system after everything he saw in D.C. His entire identity had been crafted to protect him, to let him move unseen. And the moment the system broke again, he'd done what he was meant to do. Expose it. From the shadows, into the light. But even now, as the cheers rang out and the headline spread, James, or rather, Jordan, knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something much bigger. The sun was starting to set over the courthouse steps when Jordan, finally walked outside. The crowd erupted the moment they saw him. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and students from his school clapped and cheered. But Jordan didn't smile. Not yet. There was still too much he was processing. Too many faces, too many voices still waiting for justice. Emily stood beside him, holding her phone in one hand and brushing away a tear with the other. "You did it," she said softly. "You really did it." Jordan looked out at the street, where a few familiar students from school held signs that read, "We believe you and justice for Marcus." For the first time since stepping foot in that courtroom, he allowed himself to breathe. Really breathe. "I couldn't have done any of it alone," he replied. "You believed in me when no one else did." Behind them, Marcus stood on the courthouse steps, giving a quiet interview to a news crew. The same boy who had once been expelled and erased was now speaking for others who never got their day in court. His voice was calm, steady, full of truth. Jordan smiled faintly. That, more than any verdict, felt like a real victory. In the days that followed, the fallout spread quickly. News outlets picked up the story, calling it the student who beat the system. Articles titled "Teenage Genius Uncovers Scholarship Fraud" and "Judge Mocked Him, Now the Nation Knows His Name" were shared across every platform. But what made headlines more than the trial itself was what came next. The Department of Education launched a formal probe into the districts named in the investigation. Board members resigned. Funds were frozen. Families came forward, telling stories that echoed Marcus's and Jordan's, students overlooked, discredited, and silenced. Principal Gray was placed on administrative leave within a week. Under mounting pressure, Martin DeMarco stepped down from the school board and disappeared from public view. Subpoenas followed. And slowly, the truth that had been buried for years began rising to the surface. At school, things changed too. The same teachers who once looked at Jordan with suspicion now nodded respectfully when he passed in the hallway. Students who used to laugh behind his back now left notes in his locker saying thank you. He never gloated, never said, "I told you so." He just kept walking, quietly, purposefully, like someone who had already moved on to what came next. One afternoon, Jordan and Emily sat together on the school bleachers after everyone had gone home. The air was still, and for the first time in weeks, there was silence. "People are going to find out who you really are," she said gently. "Are you ready for that?" He nodded slowly. "I think so." She looked over at him. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Jordan was quiet for a moment. "Because I didn't want to be treated like some mystery. I wanted to be seen for who I am, not what I used to be, or what I was trained to do." Emily leaned her head against his shoulder. "Well, now the whole world knows who you are. And they're better for it." The next week, he was offered a place in an elite summer program for young legal scholars in Washington, D.C., ironically, not far from where his journey began. The invitation letter came with a handwritten note from a Supreme Court clerk: "We've been watching. You're the kind of voice the future needs." He read the letter twice before folding it carefully into his bag. It was tempting. It felt right. But he also knew there was unfinished business right here at home. Before leaving, Jordan used his remaining weeks at school to help other students reapply for scholarships, this time with honest oversight. He met with new board members, spoke to school leaders, and helped draft a set of reforms to ensure something like this never happened again. Every step felt like a small brick in rebuilding trust. And then, one evening, he returned to the courthouse. Not as a defendant or a headline, but as a guest speaker. The local youth program had invited him to share his story with students who thought they didn't matter. Jordan walked up to the podium in a plain shirt and jeans, no script, no spotlight. Just a microphone, a room full of hopeful eyes, and the truth. "I wasn't supposed to win," he told them. "They laughed at me. They doubted me. But what they didn't see was how many others stood behind me. How many of us carry stories that deserve to be heard. You don't have to be in a courtroom to fight for justice. Sometimes, you just have to speak when no one else will." The room fell silent, the kind of silence that sticks to your bones. And then, slowly, the applause began. That night, as he walked back to the car, Jordan looked up at the sky, the stars just beginning to break through. It felt different now. Lighter. Brighter. The case was over. The truth had been spoken. But something deeper had shifted. Not just in him, but in everyone who had watched, listened, and realized that even one voice, no matter how young, could shake the walls of power. Back at home, his mom was waiting at the kitchen table with a plate of his favorite food and that same quiet smile she always wore when she knew he needed it. She didn't ask questions. She just reached for his hand and gave it a squeeze. "You're still my boy," she whispered. "But now the world knows what I've always known." And in that moment, more than any applause or article or offer letter, Jordan felt complete. Not because he'd beaten the odds, but because he'd told the truth. And the truth had finally been heard. As the screen fades to black, the last thing you hear is Jordan's voice, steady, sure, and unforgettable. Sometimes the smallest voice is the one that changes everything. The story ends. But the message lives on.